At its absolute peak, the British Empire spanned the entire globe, dictating the trade and politics of hundreds of millions of people. But the origin point of all that projection was a small, fog-drenched island sitting on the absolute edge of the known European world. For the first half of its existence, this land projected zero power outward. It was deeply fractured, divided among warring local tribes, and served as a highly attractive target for massive continental powers looking for resources. The island has seen continuous human habitation since the end of the last glacial period, around 13,000 years ago. These earliest populations erected massive stone structures, with the heavy megaliths of Stonehenge standing as the most famous monuments they left behind. However, geographic isolation did not offer safety. The lack of a single, centralized defensive force turned the island into a permanent landing zone for anyone with a fleet and a desire to expand their borders. The first major centralized conquest arrived in AD 43. The Roman Empire crossed the Channel and systematically subjugated the native Celtic Britons, maintaining strict control over the province of Britannia for nearly 4 centuries. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was buckling under its own weight. The legions packed up and withdrew to the continent to defend Rome, abandoning the province entirely. The sudden departure of the Roman military apparatus created a massive power vacuum. The native Britons were suddenly left without a professional army, leaving the eastern and southern coastlines entirely undefended. The collapse of Roman rule immediately plunged the region into political chaos. It opened the door for a brutal 1,000-year period defined entirely by consecutive waves of foreign invasion. The first to fill the Roman void were the Anglo-Saxons, a collection of Germanic tribes who crossed the North Sea. They settled in large numbers, slowly establishing their own competing kingdoms and replacing the native Britannic languages with Old English. By the time these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms established themselves, the next wave arrived. Beginning around AD 800, Norsemen from Scandinavia began launching highly organized, relentless Viking raids on the island's coastal monasteries and settlements. The Norsemen didn't leave after raiding. They carved out their own massive territories in the north and east. The daily threat of arriving longships forced a desperate response from the remaining Anglo-Saxon rulers. To survive the Viking incursions, the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms realized they had to pool their military and economic resources. Through decades of warfare and political maneuvering, they successfully coalesced into a single, unified Kingdom of England by the 10th century. Even as a unified kingdom, the external attacks continued. The defining test arrived in 1066, when an expedition from northern France, led by William the Conqueror, crossed the English Channel. The native defenders were crushed at the Battle of Hastings. William's highly trained Norman cavalry slaughtered the English leadership, allowing him to install a heavily militarized French-speaking ruling class across the entire country. The Norman victory initiated a massive campaign of castle building and border fortification. By establishing this permanent, fortified military presence, 1066 marked the last time the island's leadership would be completely replaced by an external conquering force. With the borders finally sealed against outsiders, the violence turned inward. For the next several centuries, the ruling House of Plantagenet waged a series of bloody internal power struggles, while also fighting the 100 Years' War to assert their inherited claims over the Kingdom of France. This constant warfare required heavy taxation, which triggered a massive rebellion from the local barons. This 1215 parchment, the Magna Carta, shows their formal solution, a legal framework that officially limited the monarch's absolute power and laid the groundwork for an eventual parliament. The internal tension eventually erupted into a brutal, decades-long succession crisis known as the Wars of the Roses. 2 rival branches of the Plantagenet family, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, decimated each other, fighting for control of the throne. The bloodshed only ended in 1485, when Henry Tudor seized the crown. He and his descendants, including King Henry VIII, stabilized the realm through sheer force of will and ruthless centralization of power. Centuries of surviving rebellions, civil wars, and legal compromises had forged a battle-tested national administration. The English state emerged highly organized, deeply paranoid, and exceptionally resilient. The final explosion of internal violence occurred during the rule of the Stuart dynasty in the 1600s. An ideological clash over who actually controlled the country, the king or the parliament, ignited the English Civil War. This historical engraving depicts the climax of that conflict in 1649. The parliamentarians defeated the royalists, put King Charles I on trial for treason, and publicly executed him on a wooden block. For the crowds watching from the rooftops, the world had turned upside down. England functioned briefly as a military dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell, before the exhausted public eventually agreed to restore the monarchy under heavy restrictions. Seeking total geographic security, England formally subsumed Wales, and in 1707 passed the Act of Union to officially merge with Scotland, creating a single sovereign state called Great Britain. By surviving and resolving its own intense internal friction, Great Britain had forged itself into a highly unified, stable military power. The island was finally ready to turn its attention outward. Having secured its borders and unified its government, Great Britain reversed its historical role. It transitioned from a fractured, divided territory absorbing attacks to an aggressive maritime force intent on global colonization. This expansion was supercharged by the Industrial Revolution, which began in England. Steam power, mechanized factories, and advanced metallurgy gave the British Navy massive technological leverage over nearly any opponent they encountered. This 1886 map, titled Imperial Federation, visualizes the result of that leverage. The shaded territories reveal a vast colonial network stretching across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The sheer scale of this dominance was personified by Queen Victoria, whose reign oversaw aggressive expansion of British industry, military, and cultural influence worldwide. By leveraging its naval supremacy to connect distant territories, this tiny, vulnerable island successfully engineered itself into the largest empire in recorded human history. But maintaining control over a quarter of the globe required immense economic resources. The intense geopolitical friction of the 20th century, specifically the massive cost of fighting two brutal world wars, rapidly drained the empire's capacity to hold its overseas territories. Furthermore, the massive aerial bombardments of the 1940s brought immense physical devastation directly back to the island. The sudden return of an existential military threat shattered the illusion of British invulnerability. Bankrupt and militarily exhausted, Great Britain faced widespread demands for self-rule. A rapid process of decolonization began as territories across the globe successfully campaigned for and won their independence. Over a few short decades, the massive global web dissolved. The states' formal borders receded exactly to where they started, the coastlines of the original island, leaving behind a heavily industrialized, modern democratic nation. The modern world carries the deep imprint of an island that spent half its history absorbing the cultures and armies of its invaders, and the other half actively exporting that combined identity to every corner of the globe.